Not changing who I am to fit into what you think a journalist is.
I've had my work dismissed as, because of the minority I belong to, that like I'm an activist rather than a journalist. And it's something that's made me have to reflect on, like, what is that line?
The same with sustainability in fashion. You know, there's lots of conversations that have become much more prominent because of that two-way communication.
You can't say that that's wrong. Journalism develops, it grows. That's what it is, and it always has done.
I mean, I just don't particularly think it's activism to think that you deserve human rights and to advocate for them in the public sphere, but I am part of a minority that's very much a media target in this country at the moment.
Just because someone says that a space isn't for you doesn't mean you can't fight your hardest to make that space for you.
Yo guys, what's good? Welcome to London College of Communication's Value Talks, a series where we bring together figures from across the creative industries to chat about contemporary issues and the importance of creativity. Today I'm super excited to be joined by Henry Holland, Charlene White and Shon Faye. Welcome guys. Just to introduce you to myself, I'm Tim, I'm also from LCC, graduated in 2017. I will go around the room and I'll let you introduce yourselves, so we'll go with you, Henry.
I'm Henry Holland, also a graduate of LCC. I'm not going to say which year because my Botox starts to get too much work. I am a creative consultant. I founded my fashion line House of Holland in 2006. And now I work with lots of different people and I've just started a ceramic line as well.
It's amazing. Hi, I'm Charlene White. I am a presenter for ITV News and Loose Women, and I'm also an LCC graduate.
Hi, I'm Shon Faye. I am a writer, editor, podcast presenter. I mostly do freelance work, and I'm currently working on a book about trans issues in the UK.
Awesome. Thank you very much, guys, for coming. Thank you for your time. Today's talk is all about journalism. So really, we're just still going to be discussing the idea that journalism is forever transitioning in terms of if you look from where it started to where it is now, but especially now, what is the role of a journalist when we have things like social media where anybody on Instagram or Twitter or any platform that they choose can be a communicator of their certain said topics or something like that. So, Henry, I wanted to start with you because obviously you've probably had the most drastic shift out of all of us in terms of you started with journalism and then you've gone into fashion, ceramics. So tell us a bit about your journey, your story, and where you find yourself now and what your thoughts on being a journalist in journalism.
Yeah, sure. I feel like my degree in journalism was a really great sort of grounding and kind of basis for me to sort of set off on my creative career, for sure. I feel like it sort of taught me so many things in terms of how to communicate. And I think you touched on that in your introduction. You know, journalism is a form of communication, very much so. And, you know, knowing how to communicate to the right people and get your message or your work across in the right way is what I took away from my journalism degree. I didn't feel like I'd done the right course. I felt like I should have done something more creative, but then in turn that just drove me to turn my qualification into something much more creative and more useful for myself. And on the flip side, I studied with all the editors of all the fashion magazines, so you know, if I need an article writing about myself, I've got dirt on most of them, so I can usually get some coverage quite easily. So there was lots of different benefits. Yeah, but it was completely the right course. You know, I was like, I've seen you be sick on your shoes and cheapskates on a Tuesday, so you should probably write about it.
Yeah. What about you, Charlene? Obviously, you're more traditional in a sense, but how have you found your role through journalism?
Well, I specifically chose to do a print journalism course, knowing that I wanted to do broadcast journalism because I wanted to get a print foundation. And writing was always my thing. And I figured as long as I know how to write an article, as long as I'm writing it in the right way, then any other skills that I need to be a broadcast journalist, I can learn on the job. So it was a very much a conscious decision not to do broadcast journalism. That and Nottingham Trent University rejected me. Not that I'm still upset about that. Nottingham Trent, I mean, who even are they?
Yeah.
You know.
But to have that insight, to know that much about what you wanted your past to be at 17, I think is amazing, because I had no clue, which is why I did journalism in the first place. Because I felt like a degree where I could learn a skill which I could then transfer to lots of different areas. So I wanted to write about fashion, but somebody advised me to just get the grounding skills of how to write. Yeah. and then you can transfer that to whatever topics or areas that you want to discuss. But for you to have that like broadcast, print kind of knowledge and sort of path, I think it's amazing.
Just when I started looking into doing journalism, I think I'd gone to like a careers fair or something, and I knew I loved writing, and I knew I wanted to change the world in some way. And at the careers fair, this whole idea of being a journalist sort of came up, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. I don't come from a media family, so I didn't really know what was involved. So, and when I was looking into it, LCC, or LCP, as it was then, London College of Printing, was always heralded as the oldest journalism degree in the country. So I figured, well, that'll be all right. I didn't want to stay in London because I live in London. I wanted to have the experience of being on a campus and living with loads of other students, but that just didn't happen. So I ended up being in London. And when I chose to do journalism, my parents were really, really upset. And they really, really didn't want me to do the course because they said I'd be unemployed for the rest of my life. So they wanted me, I'm an immigrant family. So, you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're an accountant, all those stable jobs. And they said they wanted me to do English instead. And I spent a week, when the UCAS form had to be done, I spent that week arguing with them because they're like, you can't do journalism. I've not moved here for you to just become a journalist. And so we fought a lot about it, and I was very determined that this is exactly what I was going to do. And they were really upset because they felt it was a waste of education, and they'd spend their life, trying to get me to do something else. But obviously it worked out in the end.
When did they come on?
When I got my first job.
Great.
They did, in the end. They were still a little bit on the fence about it, but in the end, as far as I'm concerned, you don't raise a confident, intelligent and outspoken woman who then makes her own decision, you don't like it. Yeah. I said, you can't have it both ways, which was my argument. That didn't go down too well.
That's a very concise argument to have, though. And actually it's funny because I was supposed to do journalism up until like 3 weeks before I switched to media and culture. And I remember I switched and my mum was like, I know what journalism, she was like, journalism's papers. So I know where the job is there. Media and what? Yeah. Where are you going to go? And I'm like, yeah, but I get to do this. I also do photography and film, and all it just sounds like you're not going to make money. And so it's interesting that you had a problem with journalism, not English, and I'm having, a slight issue, but it's past it now. My mum understands.
It probably didn't help that my cousin, who's next in line above me in our family, because there's loads of us, he went to Cambridge and did law. Oh. So for my parents, it was like, well, one of you has managed to go to Oxbridge, so what's happening to the rest of you? And they're going, well, I'm going to do journalism. So that's not what they were expecting at all. But, they just wanted me to be happy in the end.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And Shon, what about yourself? Obviously, with the fact that you do comedy and podcasting, was journalism always something you wanted? Did you always see yourself expanding? Was journalism always your kind of background or the base?
No, not at all. It's all been quite random. I mean, I originally did an English lit degree, and I think a lot of people thought I was going to be a journalist because I did a lot of student journalism, and then the recession, I'm revealing my age now, the recession kind of hit in 2008, which was just around when I was going to be graduating, and I had a panic, kind of like what Charlene said about family influence, and I was like, I can't be a writer, I can't do journalism because it's just, I'm never going to earn any money, and now we're in a recession, so I'm going to become a corporate lawyer. And everyone was like, you sure? I would have spent...
It's quite a left turn.
I love that. The handbrake just went up, man.
I spent 3 years going around university in Mac Pigment eyeshadow and Henry Holland t-shirts. So people were like, are you sure this is you? So I went off and trained as a corporate lawyer. And then obviously that was a mistake. And I started doing some writing alongside that as I was training to be a solicitor, kind of knowing that as soon as I qualified, I was probably not going to remain in the law very long. And so from there, I could have done a journalism master's or degree, but I didn't because I went law cost so much and I wasn't going to retrain after that. So I've had to I sort of slid into it sideways by just building it up. And I think things like social media, Twitter, have changed the culture a bit, that you can sort of gain entry to or build relationships with editors and publications via social media. Maybe less so now, actually, but certainly 5-6 years ago. So that's kind of how I slid into it. Okay. And then ever since then, it's just evolved. It's not really been something I've ever intended.
Yeah. Do you think journalism then, I know this is an open question, do you think journalism is a great base for you to slide, like you just said, slide into different things? Because all of you have been able to kind of manipulate your own roots in it and still carry forms, even with your fashion, carry forms of documentation with your podcast, with your comedy, with Loose Women. You know what I mean? It's all kind of giving you different platforms to be able to kind of say everything that's important to you, but still hit different angles and different ears and grab people alongside, if you get what I mean.
I think, like, obviously it depends on what area of journalism, because there's someone that came into it kind of, like, if you're going to be doing like investigative reporting,
Yes.
like, I do think you need like proper reporting training for
Yes.
like on ethics, the law, how to do all that. Like, that's beyond my ken. And actually, I kind of get quite annoyed at a lot of grifters in the media, maybe who should be better trained when they're with some of the stuff that they're doing. But like, certainly, yeah, I think some of the more, there's a creative side to it too, and I think like things like presenting, podcasting, like that sort of stuff, I do think can be quite self-directed, which is quite nice. I don't know.
But your training as a solicitor, that must have put you in, it set you in good stead for the way in which we deal with journalism, right?
Yeah, it did. I think it's that lawyers are very risk averse, so I think it's quite good to have like, I need to double check everything and also not defame anyone. Those are quite good lessons.
Whereas I think our law, the module of the law in our degree was about 3 hours a month for like 2 months. We're like, and they said that.
Basically, I don't think I did a law exam, actually. I don't even think we did our law exam. Did you do a law exam?
I mean, it was
tenuous.
Oh yeah, I don't really remember if we did. I just remember lots of history and politics. I wasn't that into.
Were you still doing T-line?
Yeah. The only thing I can still write is the.
I can't write any of my T-line at all. That's a bit I
T-line's like a form of shorthand.
Shorthand,
that
I
they
was
used to
gonna
teach us so that you could sit there and like write notes, and then literally the minute we finished it, it'd be like, but we've got an iPhone, so.
Basically, and because I knew I wasn't going to be, my plan wasn't to be a print reporter.
Yeah.
I knew that I'm unlikely to be sat court reporting, which is where you would need the T-line really. So it was like, well, there's pointless me doing this bit. So I don't actually think I went to any T-line lessons, to be honest. I was like, this is a waste of my time.
Yeah, I'm better than
I love how the
I
cat's
was
coming
supposed to
out
help.
of the bag and it's just like, just literally all these secrets are just uncovering.
It's slowly coming out.
Yeah.
But I think, no, I think it's, I mean, I've already said it, I guess, but it's about communication and doing that in a way that is interesting and exciting and kind of engaging to an audience. And I think, yeah, like Shon says, obviously there's certain parts of journalism, like, investigative reporting, which obviously is much more, specific in terms of skill sets and sort of background understanding. But I think a lot of the journalism that we've all done over the years has been a lot of kind of sharing experiences and kind of, reporting on other people's lives and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that is the best journalism, when you can report on people's lives, share experiences, but regurgitate that in a way that people start to either look at themselves in the mirror or can relate. And I think especially with Charlene and yourself, Shon, like, I was going to ask, like, what, and you, Henry, of course, but like, what responsibilities does a journalist in your professions have? Because you two have been prominent in recent times of defending said issues and going against, and even being put on panels where it seems like you're having to be armoured up and stuff. So what would you say is a responsibility for a modern journalist?
Well, I think historically, we were probably all taught that the journalist never becomes the story. The story is the most important thing. And I think with the elevation of things like social media, like Shon is saying, things have shifted somewhat, because we don't just have a voice when we're writing an article for a newspaper or when I pop up on lunchtime news. An audience is able to consume us in so many more different ways now. One thing that I am very mindful of, and I know that it became an issue, there are various different things that I will write about. So be it pulling out of doing Society of Editors, the press awards, for example, and hosting that, or be it talking about things like not wearing a poppy on screen, all of those things, I will write the articles about it because those are things that I really do strongly believe in. But then you won't see me doing a panel about it. You won't see me being interviewed on the radio about it, because I will make a point about something and then it's left there, because I don't want to be what is discussed. It's the issue that I want to be discussed. And the Society of Editors press awards is a good example of that. If I had then So I had to go out and do a ton of interviews about that decision. Then the issue regarding racism within institutions, that would then be forgotten. And that is the issue that I wanted people to be talking about, and that's what ended up happening. And I know that it's not something historically that journalists are used to doing, but journalism, by nature of what it is, it develops over time, and it you know, it's the ebb and flow of life is reflected within journalism. And the fact that, yes, you have those, you know, the stable of TV, radio and newspapers and magazines, but now you have social media, you have podcasts, you have online publications, you have people that are journalists just on social media. You can't say that that's wrong. Journalism develops, it grows. That's what it is, and it always has done.
And what about yourself, Shon?
Yeah, I mean, I think the difficult thing is, you know, I've had my work dismissed as, because of the minority I belong to, that like I'm an activist rather than a journalist. And it's something that's made me have to reflect on, like, what is that line? Because, I mean, I just don't particularly think it's activism to think that you deserve human rights and to advocate for them in the public sphere, but I am part of a minority that's very much a media target in this country at the moment. And yeah, it becomes difficult because, yeah, I think in the certainly when I first started writing and first started getting published about sort of 5-6 years ago, there was definitely an appetite for, like, everything had to be like a personal story or a personal narrative, which is very common for, like, young women, people of colour, and trans people in the media. Is like more mind your own experience. And actually, yeah, I think I reached a point where I realised, okay, I don't want to write about myself anymore. And actually, if I write about trans people, which I do a lot, then I'm going to interview subjects, and I'm a journalist who's reported on it. It's not it's not like a personal manifesto. But that's frustrating. It currently doesn't really fit into the media landscape in the UK, in that I would say that there's largely a consensus against trans equality in much of the traditional media in the UK. And that makes being a trans journalist or writer within that very difficult, because it's very difficult to constantly write or to have to judge whether or not you work with outlets, platforms that have also platformed things that are actively making your community's life worse. It's a fine balance, and it's why I'm writing a book. And I think it's interesting to see that, like, political non-fiction, which is what I'm writing, has expanded as a book category in the last 5 years, is because I think it's because of the newspapers and traditional media often aren't, particularly for minorities, aren't really providing the space to do in-depth writing, interviews and stuff like that.
Not particularly non-fiction either, quite a lot of them. There's definitely a whole area that needs to pick back up the non-fiction side.
Have you had, Shon, have you had instances where journalists that perhaps you've looked up to historically have perhaps had views that surprised you where trans activism is concerned?
I mean, like, negative ones about trans people. Yeah, loads of time. Unfortunately, one of the things that's really common, and I know that other trans people who work in media have said this too, is that, like, actually it kind of makes you have no heroes, because it can be really difficult to. I just don't invest in. I know who's kind of like a good egg in the sense. I know that more easily than having a list of who isn't. Like, it's actually easier to know who you can probably trust. But yeah, that's difficult. I mean, there are people that you've looked up to, and you can just, even sometimes it will be just an article that they share, and it's, you know, you couldn't really say that it's horribly bigoted, but it's just like it, you know, it's. I mean, one of the things that I would say about, like, trans people in the media, which I'm constantly banging this drum, is like, there are no trans editors at any newspaper. There are no trans staff writers, to my knowledge, at any newspaper in the UK. I don't know of any trans news producers in television or radio. So it's like, we're not in the media.
Where's the conversation coming from, and who's guiding it? If it's constantly from people that, this is a problem that I'm sure you've said as well.
We have. I mean, I was just thinking about what you're saying, and we do have a couple of trans people at ITN, and the impact that they will have in terms of pitching stories and, I guess, advising and guiding in the way that we will cover stories, as you have with any minority within the country. If you have those people represented within your organisation, the way stories are dealt with is completely different. I don't understand why someone would fight against that. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, and I think this is the thing, sometimes journalists have a kind of conceit. I think that they're like you were saying about not just that you shouldn't ever be the story, but like we're objective. We're this kind of important social role that we hold power to account, which is interesting because sometimes I think not holding power to account, you are the embodiment of power in some parts of the media, is, it's this idea that we're kind of human neutral. But actually that's not the case, because like if you had to see a trans colleague every day at the water cooler, it would probably make you think differently about how you write about trans people. That's just how human beings work. So it's this like refusal to reflect on it as a group of people with subjective opinions, a profession. It's the same thing as class and the private school background. The media is very unwilling to self-examine in this country sometimes, I think.
And I want to pick up on a point that I think you mentioned, Shon, and I want to ask it for all of you, is how do you separate the idea of being a journalist, and how do you navigate that when all you want is a story to come out, but people are inadvertently going to come back to you, if that makes sense?
I want you to answer this, Henry, because I don't know about you, Shon, when you talk about wearing Henry Holland t-shirts. Oh my God, that's all I wanted to wear. That's all I wanted to wear. Oh my goodness me. But it wasn't just House of Holland, the fashion house. People just wanted to know you because you just seemed like the most amazing person in the world. And now I've met you, you totally are. Yeah. But
we just need to pick you up, really.
Did that come with pressure that people knew as much of you as a designer? They knew you. They knew, you got signature hair, all of that stuff, as much as they knew your label.
Well, I really suffered with imposter complex because I didn't study design at all. So for me, my design aesthetic was a little bit journalistic because I just bought t-shirts and wrote on them. I didn't design or sew those t-shirts. They were American Apparel wholesale. Top tip. And then I printed on them. So like I was printing rhyming couplets, and from a political stance, I was at that point in my life, I didn't feel well read or educated enough to comment on any political issues whatsoever, and so I was very anti making political statements with my t-shirts. And my t-shirts were about showing admiration and love for other designers, which is where the whole concept came from, and I wanted it to be kind of like nudge nudge wink wink, obviously sexual because can't help myself, and like it was that was kind of the idea, was that I was uplifting and sort of celebrating other designers that I wanted to be like. So the stuff about me I felt more comfortable with in a way because it wasn't about my design aesthetic. It wasn't like sort of questioning my skills at the sewing machine, because I've never sewn a garment in my life.
Still?
No.
There you are, kids. Don't worry. Your fashion dream is
not really.
It's much alive.
I'm a machinist, like other designers. Like, because I jumped that step of the graduate collection of making your first collection in your bedroom. So I then jumped straight to working with machinists and pattern cutters, where I would design the pieces and then someone else would help me execute them. So I always felt really uncomfortable with any attention shining a light on my skills as a designer, as a, all of those things. So, and I guess there was just a whole series of other events that took place that were just so like serendipitous. I don't know how you want to put it, but my best friend at the time, who was my housemate, became the most famous supermodel in the world. At the same week, I launched my t-shirts, and so there was just a focus of attention on both of us from both sides of the Atlantic, because she quickly moved to New York. So it was, in a way, it was weird, but in a way, there was a side of me that was maybe a little bit more comfortable with that, because I could just be my authentic self and kind of just loud and annoying and obnoxious. Whereas when it was about the seriousness of like design and the cut and like, or the side of my sort of any critique around my fashion, I always felt a little bit more nervous and uncomfortable around, because I had this imposter complex. Yeah. Didn't help that a lot of reviewers maybe brought it up quite a lot, that I was untrained. Rather than self-trained, they used the term untrained, and I was like, well, I've been doing it now for 10 years, so...
And were they still talking about you as being...
No, I think that was more maybe 3 or 4 years in. But I was like, I have been doing this for quite a while now. So, yeah, there was... At points, I would flip-flop for sure, but at points I'd be like, can you just talk about my clothes and not about my friend sat on the front row? And then at other points I'd be like, don't talk about my clothes, I'm scared, what are you going to say? Talk about me. So I guess it's kind of a bit of both.
And in terms of sort of stuff with me and being quiet, I've always been outspoken. So there's nothing that I say on Loose Women that I haven't been saying all of my life. I'm the child of a social worker. So in terms of fighting for rights for those who tend to be voiceless, that's all I was around, with my mum working with children and families, working as a social worker for the local council. So that's something she instilled in all of us. And that's why when I sort of think about, I know it's going to sound ridiculous when I say I just wanted to do a job where I could change the world. I originally wanted to do law, like you, and then fell asleep in Croydon Crown Court because it was really boring in my work experience. I was like, maybe this isn't the job for me. And then thought maybe I'll change the world by telling the stories of those who tend to have quieter voices and are very rarely listened to. And so that is something that I have done continuously. So there isn't anything different that I do in Loose Women that I have not been doing my entire life, be it on panels, be it on interviews, maybe not, perhaps in the way that stories are told on ITV News, the kinds of stories that I tell on ITV News as a journalist. I've always done it in that way. The difference is it's coming out of my mouth perhaps in a more conversational manner than when I do the news.
I think it's not censoring yourself in any way, knowing that you're in that different forum. I think that's the power in it. It's not self-censoring yourself, which I think we're all guilty of doing when we're aware of being in a certain arena and kind of, sort of being a bit careful, but just still being true to yourself, true to your beliefs, and expressing them in exactly the same way. I think that's where the power is.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's the experience as well. So it's knowing the way to talk about things in a way that engages an audience and perhaps enables an audience to think about things a little bit more carefully. And what I would love if people, perhaps watch the stuff that I do and they sort of sit, having their lunch or whatever, or if I'm doing a documentary with Trevor that airs next week, and I'd love people to sort of sit there and, have conversations, perhaps think about things in a slightly different way. And that's the advantage of having programs that has a mix of people, as opposed to, I don't know, if you were to have a program that was full of privately educated Oxbridge men, for example.
So most programs.
Shade, no shade.
You're probably only going to get one view, and it's not to say that view is wrong. It's just to say that there are many, many, many other views that exist within this wonderful environment and country that is Britain. That we aren't some universal being that only shares one experience of life. We share so many experiences of life, and there's no reason why we cannot have that reflected on our TV screens and in the papers and magazines that we consume.
Actually it's funny, I'm also the child of a social worker, so there's another little overlap. And my sister's one as well. And I think it's the same thing about it being instilled. And kind of what I recognise as well in terms of, doing this work, as a kind of person from this minority, is that within that minority, I did go to Oxford. I am middle class. I am white. So as trans people in this country go, I'm pretty much like the upper echelons in terms of privilege. I don't try and do guilt about that because I don't think it's particularly helpful. I think one of the things that is that I probably have them more lead into this very traditional profession, even though I'm on the margins of it because I'm trans, is that for me, I would rather, I see it as kind of like, well, the way that I do this is to try and think about how my writing can platform the voices of people whose trans experience is not mine and is significantly different and probably in many respects has been worse. So there is an element of that, but I think, it's interesting because I kind of I've worked a lot with fashion magazines, and that was my first getting in was Vice, ID, Dazed, and kind of like what Henry was saying. So I've interviewed a lot. There was a period where any trans model or intersex model, whatever, they'd be like, interviewer.
You'll know what to say.
We've got someone for you today. I'm sure you have.
And again, these are very if they're fashion models, they're quite privileged trans women as trans women go. But I think what it made me realise is that I really love all that kind of avant-garde kind of that side of culture. I really think people need that too. It's like trans representation, like Euphoria or television. It's like culture is one of the most powerful ways. But and I think trans people have made huge steps in terms of culture and in the fashion world and in music. But actually in politics and kind of the more traditional arenas, they're just lagging behind. So as much as I've been drawn to kind of creativity, I kind of think, it's maybe time to to try and make an insurgency in traditional media.
Of course, we need it unless it filters through to everywhere. It's not really a win, is it? It's just a kind of like, you're good here, but you're not good here, right? And
it's like seeing progress in one arena is encouraging, but then it's always important to recognise how it's kind of, you know, represented across.
And that's how people, a lot of times, that's how they'll use it against us in sports. So like, oh, black people are good at sports. Like, we love LeBron James. So, you know, what's the issue? And it's like, yeah, but I can't dunk 60 times in a game and I'm not 6'9". You know what I mean? Like, I just want to be a regular person, should still be allowed to be a regular person.
And who's also allowed to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And I think that when you're put on the pedestal of, well, you are speaking for trans people, or you are speaking for those who perhaps are self-trained as designers, or you are speaking as a black female broadcaster, you tend to be put on that pedestal. And and if you make any slight mistake, it's as though it's the worst thing in the world. And you aren't who you said you were, and all these sort of accusations. But the reality of it is we are human beings. And yes, we have put ourselves at the forefront of things, but we also know we at some point will get like a barrage of stuff, negative stuff coming in our direction. Of course you will. But that's where you sort of end up with like this armour around you, and try really hard, I guess, not to make those mistakes, but they will happen. And I think people also have to understand that we are human beings and we will make mistakes, but it doesn't mean that we weren't the person we were yesterday. Of course we are.
Of course.
And what I find strange is that, like, I'm just a writer, but because of my identity, like, there are whole swathes of like social media where I'm like a real hate figure. I mean, like, it's something I've had to like learn to deal with, this public persona that's nothing to do with me. And it's because I'm a trans woman and these people do not like trans women, and I have to, but it's very much based around me, my life, long forum posts about like, what surgery I've had, what I look like, picking apart. That's really odd, and I don't think it's something people have had to contend with until the last 10 years, just for like, I would have just written, 20 years ago, a journalist or opinion writer would just write a piece, and maybe someone would send you a slightly aggressive letter once a month or something. So yeah, that it's a really strange one, and I think it's the hardest thing, because I think it's one of the things, I don't know if Charlene would agree, that it discourages maybe people from minorities going into the media or assuming platforms, is that that's its intention, is to make other people from your group, whether it's black women, trans women, is to look and be like, that person's getting quite a lot of abuse. I don't know that I want to put myself forward for that. And that's kind of its mechanism. And so I don't really have a solution for it, but I think, it's definitely something that I think people who, are acquiring a platform, I'm very keen for like people to have training, to have like workshops around it. And I think that's growing. It's this awareness that if you're going to have younger people, particularly from marginalised or minority backgrounds, out there in public, that to kind of preserve their own mental health and things like that.
I mean, I don't get it as much as I used to, but then do I? I think maybe I don't. It doesn't affect me as much as it used to. Don't forget that when I'd not been wearing a poppy on screen for a long time before a member of the EDL who didn't live, I wasn't doing that much national news at that time, I was mostly a London presenter. And this member of the EDL outside of London was told that there was this black girl reading the news on ITV in London who doesn't wear a poppy. He then posted on Facebook for his followers to abuse me in any which way they could find me, and that's exactly what they did. And this was back, this is, like 6-7 years ago now. And it was very much a targeted attack, and I couldn't work out why it was happening because I wasn't even on air the day where all this stuff started coming in. And actually someone then screen grabbed this guy's post and emailed it to me, and I was like, oh, this is why it's happening. And they started a Sack the Slag campaign. They were calling into ITV to get me sacked. They were routinely calling into both ITN and ITV to share how awful it is that this black girl is disrespecting our troops. I come from a forces family. There was a lot of go back to where you came from. There was a lot of superimposing my head on monkeys, and there was all of that stuff. And then I was then able to release a statement detailing my reasons why and the fact I come from a forces family. And then that's when the tide turned. And I had some amazing messages from a lot of older vets, from the British Legion, from just wonderful people who were calling then into ITV to say they couldn't believe this was happening and they have my support and all that sort of stuff. And that was sort of, you're right, it's only been sort of in the last 10 years, and it sort of took us all by surprise because this had never happened before. And we hadn't really seen it happen to an ITV journalist before at all. Now, weirdly, unfortunately, it's quite normal. But back then, it wasn't at all. And it upset me in a way I didn't realise that racists could upset me anymore. You know, when you grow up as a minority, you're used to kind of stuff being thrown in your way.
Did it stop their abuse, or did it just quieten it with all the positive
well, I sort of had people replying to all the racists,
shutting them up,
and then that ended up shutting them down. But routinely, and I do think a few of them have it as a date in their diary,
right.
Because as soon as remembrance period comes along in the autumn, it really gains momentum again. And for both my pregnancies, I've not been in work. I've been on maternity leave. And yet, I would still get the abuse online, despite the fact I wasn't even on screen and hadn't been for months because I was busy having children. But I will still get it every year. And if I talk about anything regarding to do with any minority, it can be if I'm talking about friends who are gay, or talking about trans activism, or talking about race, or talking about disability, I will always get a certain section of social media who are just completely against anybody having any of those conversations whatsoever. But that does not bother me in any shape or form. I think because of what happened to me 6 years ago, my armour is stronger now. So it doesn't affect me in the way that it did. And usually the tweets will usually have some spelling mistake or just some nonsense in it. So I'll pick up on that and I'll be like, look, if you're going to abuse me, at least, construct a sentence correctly. So I'll reply like that because I now just see them as being a bit of a joke. In terms of the new people coming into the arena, in the journalism arena, my hope is, because they have been born into the social media era and they're a little bit more savvy with negotiating it and sort of separating the good from the bad, my hope is that it doesn't affect them in the same way that it will affect we oldies. Because, we haven't grown up with it. We've sort of had to learn it as we've gotten older. So my hope is it won't put them off it, because it will just be like, this is kind of, we're used to it now.
Mm. I think there's some really positive things about social media in the fact, especially in what I do, is that it's opened a two-way conversation. Mm-hmm. There's a huge move towards more diversity and inclusion with all brands, all fashion brands, because their consumers have been able to demand it from them direct, because they've got this open line of communication to say, it's not okay that you underrepresent me and people that I know and people that I love within your imagery and campaigns and all that things. And that's really positive. Same with sustainability in fashion. There's lots of conversations that have become much more prominent because of that two-way communication. But I mean, there's just so many negatives because it just gives so many people just the opportunity to say what they think, and it gives them a platform. I get none of it, but then I'm quite conscious. I'm disappointed in myself because I'm quite consciously I edit myself a little bit in what I put out. People are like, oh, you put everything out. And I'm like, well, I don't really sort of express that many kind of political views or, anything that I feel is too contentious, because I am quite aware of self-protectionism.
Do you ever think about how especially in the fashion industry, moments that had social media existed probably would not have happened. Like Alexander McQueen, Highland rape. Can you imagine that in the era of Twitter? The discourse would be
so many things. But even just the whole period of the 90s fashion and heroin chic.
Yes.
I mean, that lasted for nearly 10 years. Yeah. I mean, if Twitter had been around, it'd be it'd be absolutely.
The think pieces what we would have.
Yeah, and they didn't come until after that period of fashion had finished. People were just kind of all okay with it.
And it's really hard to know though, because obviously some of that stuff, it's good that there's perhaps heroin chic wasn't the healthiest thing. So it's kind of good that we have those open conversations, but then there's a flip side too, that people are probably self-editing, and there's probably people who who would be doing really good stuff, but
Yeah.
don't because they're worried about abuse. So you get kind of two sides of the same coin.
I mean, I definitely use my platform wherever I can to uplift and promote lots of charities and organisations that I feel passionate about, and I do it in that way. But in terms of it's more, I guess it's more of that thing we were talking about separating myself from the story. It's like I will talk about the story, and I will really talk, as much as I can, and I use my platform in that way. But in terms of giving my own personal opinion, a lot of the times I will be very cautious, because I am really looking that I get very little abuse. I mean, every now and again you get like a bit of ridiculous homophobic abuse, and you're just like, really?
Idiots. Well, thank you very much, guys. I guess the last questions would be, what would you tell your younger self, and what advice would you have for your younger self and the younger students of UAL, LCC, journalism students? Obviously, we've all said we've all gone into different areas, but what would be your bits of nuggets and gems?
Well, because mine's been really non-traditional, and there's stuff that I was doing now that when I was a student didn't exist. The idea that I'd be presenting like a podcast where I talk to lesbian activists from the 80s, obviously in 2009 I'm like, what's a podcast? The way you can have a really divergent career I would say to my younger self is kind of be patient and don't assume that you have to know where your career is going to take you right now, because you do feel, especially when you're in your early 20s, you really feel like you're old and you have to decide. It's like you really don't know what you could be doing at 35, and there might be things that don't even exist yet that you could be doing. So it's kind of like, don't put too much pressure on yourself and allow, take opportunities as they come.
I would say to back yourself, really, because other people may not necessarily see in you what you see in yourself. And sometimes you've got to work really, really hard to prove that point. But if you back yourself and you believe in yourself and you actually have a passion for it, then it's amazing what you can end up achieving. And just because someone says that a space isn't for you, doesn't mean you can't fight your hardest to make that space for you. I would say I'm not necessarily your typical broadcast journalist, even down to the way that I talk and all that sort of stuff. And I remember when I first started doing BBC regional news in Norwich in my late 20s, and I recorded my first voiceover for a package, the response was, oh, you'll have to re-record that. That's not how we speak at the BBC. And by that point, I'd been at Radio 1 for 6 years, and the way I speak was fine. And I was very much, I'm not changing who I am to fit into what you think a journalist is. And that's why you have to back yourself and be yourself, and don't try and be somebody else. Just be you.
I would definitely echo what Shon said about patience and kind of really finding your time to find what your passion is. But for me, it's take that time to find what you truly love and are really passionate about, and turn that into your career. And don't work in the opposite way around, because I think I've managed to do that sort of coming up to nearly twice now, and they are two completely different career paths that I didn't study, that I didn't have any idea that I would ever work in. I didn't know that I would ever work in fashion, especially not as a designer, and now I'm a ceramicist, and both kind of accident. So it's basically, I'm so fortunate and privileged to have found two things that I'm hugely passionate about that I'm able to then turn into a career choice. And I think if you're able to do that, I think it's an amazing position to be in.
Thank you very much, guys. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Please like, share and subscribe, and stay tuned for more Value Talks.
Thanks, guys.
Awesome.
God, all that was missing was like wine or something.
Yeah, I know.
I was really into it.